Welcome back to our series on the certainty of identity. In this session, Identity Before the Fire, we're discussing Daniel chapter 1. And looking at the first two verses, we see that Israel is under Babylonian captivity. They went into exile, and that exile was prophetic fulfillment as it is written in Jeremiah chapter 25. Israel had turned their backs on God over and over. They'd gone through exactly what the Lord had warned them against. They were told not to take on the customs and practices of the surrounding nations. The Lord said that he would give those nations over to them, but they were not to take on worship of idols and their gods, and they were not to marry their sons and daughters to those of these pagan nations, but they did it anyway. And after the Lord specifically told them that they were to be different and set apart, they got so bold to tell him, hey, we want a king. We want to be like other nations, instead of staying with the system of judges that the Lord had instituted. That was like a rich kid telling his or her parent, look, I know you gave me these high quality and designer clothes and, shoes and the best of everything, but I would rather wear these rags. I think this is cool. I want to be down, whatever it is that they had on their mind. Or like a free person who said, hey, I'm not used to being free. Or, I want to try out bondage for a minute. I've been free all my life, as that generation had, right? I've been free all my life. And those people before us, they went through some things. But, we just kind of want to see what that was like. And it's kind of a simple-minded approach, but this is pretty much what they did without realizing it. Now, I just want to point out that captivity didn't begin in Babylon. It began when Israel forgot who they were, pretty much denied who they were, right? Just straight up going in opposition of what they had been taught. National identity eroded before political captivity began. Israel wanted to be like other nations. But while a nation forgot, 4 young men of that nation remembered. And this just segues into Daniel's story and the fact that God never leaves himself without a witness. Now, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were the sons of Judah's upper class. Their parents were royal and noble people. They were dignitaries. And so being enslaved must have been a big change for them. It had to be a culture shock. But what distinguished them was their attitude. They decided that they would remain positive and proactive where necessary. Since they were children of privilege before they were enslaved, they had a measure of skill and education, and their diligence in learning and integrating their lessons into their lives was paying off. They could walk it out. They could practice. They could have made a decision and acted like spoiled, entitled little brats and refused to participate in what they were directed to do by their captors. But instead, their identity was so embedded within them that they knew how to make right decisions and continue to stay with God. Now, the young men, they were among a group of young men of these dignitaries of Judah who were chosen to study with the wise men of the kingdom of Babylon. And after 3 years, the plan was for them to go before the king for their assignment. And so here it is that, they were being changed. They were being challenged in so many ways. And so verses 5-7 talks about how they were renamed according to the Babylonian idol gods. And that was an indirect infiltration into their faith and their culture. So when one nation takes over another nation, they're trying to change as many identifiers that nation that they had captured. They're trying to take that away so that now you belong to us. And they wanted everything. They wanted their souls as well as their bodies. And so they changed language, they changed education, and they changed names. Now that's a big thing, especially that latter part. In that time, whether they were holy or unholy people, they named people, their children, according to the characteristics of the children, or what they would have, what God would show them, and even what they saw in them. So people who didn't necessarily know God would name their children according to an experience, and places would be named as such too. I named this place, Bethel, because this is the place where, we received bread, the bread of, God and, his word. And, this is a place where he dwells. And, it just wouldn't be left to chance. And sometimes it would be out of their misery. Naomi had said in the book of Ruth, hey, my sons are dead. My husband is dead. So don't call me Naomi anymore. Naomi meaning pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Jabez's mother. And so the last reference, cross-reference in 1 Chronicles 4 said, he said that my mother named me this because she bore me in pain. And it kind of put a mark on his life. But, things can change, like we said. Anyway, they were saying something strong because renaming is not merely cosmetic. It's theological. So Daniel, whose name means judge for God, was assigned the name Belteshazzar, Prince of Bel. That was one of their false gods. Hananiah, whose name means gift of God or gift of the Lord, was assigned the name Shadrach, servant of Sin. And that's S-I-N with a capital S. And it's a proper name for the moon god. Mishael, whose name means who is what God is, was assigned the name Meshach. And that name is the same as what they tried to assign to Shadrach or to Hananiah. It is who is what is Aku. Now, Aku was the Sumerian equivalent of Sin, the moon god. So apparently this god was significant to them, and they had more than one dialect being spoken, and they named him according to that. And then finally Azariah, whose name means whom Jehovah helps or whom Yahweh helps, was assigned the name Abednego, servant of Nebo. And so these were all attempts to rewrite the allegiance and reassign the identity, and then to ultimately reprogram the theology of these young men. But the text never says that Daniel or his companions answered in agreement to the meaning of their new names. They functioned in Babylon, but they didn't internalize Babylon. Now that's a powerful distinction. It is very important. And being well studied, well versed, and learned in the Word of God, as it is written in the Torah in Exodus 23:13, says, and in all that I have said to you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. So there it was. Now, in addition to changing their language and their education and their names, they also tried to change their diets. The plan was to feed them from the king's table and give them wine to drink, and this was considered an honor. However, they knew who they were. Their identity remained intact. So just a little background, the king's meat was first offered before idols and blessed by heathen priests, and to eat it would have been considered a form of worship to them. Well, Daniel and his companions knew that this wasn't to be. It's also possible that the meat in its natural state was from animals that God declared in Leviticus 1 as unclean and not to be eaten by his chosen people, Israel. Daniel knew that a simple vegetarian diet with pure water to drink would be the healthiest, and he wanted to keep his mind alert and sharp. So he proposed the test to Melzar, who was the attendant, and Melzar allowed them for 10 days to partake of this diet, and the result was that they were superior to all the other candidates, right? So he allowed them to do that. They ate their preferred diet, and they were to be tested at the end of this 3 years of training, brought before the king, and the king would ask them questions. Now here's the key. The decision and the knowing who he was allowed him to purpose in his heart, as it is written in the word between verses 8 and 16, that he purposed in his heart not to partake of the king's delicacies. There's an important point here. Identity is settled internally before it is tested externally. Identity precedes behavior. Conviction precedes courage, and excellence flows from alignment. The king offered provision, but Daniel valued purity more than promotion. Now, just a thought here for you. If you're unsure of who you are, You will eat whatever the culture feeds you. So be careful. Get your identity intact. So looking in verses 18 through 20 of this chapter, we see that the best educated in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom were Daniel and his 3 friends. They were 10 times better than any of the other young men that were presented to the king for testing. So despite their name changes and the offer to eat special food, they maintained their identity in God because they knew who they were in Him. They could speak up for themselves and had courage to live according to their convictions. God gave them knowledge. God gave them skill. God gave Daniel understanding in visions and dreams, and they were 10 times better. Their excellence was not self-generated. It was God-given, God-driven. And it's tied up in Daniel 6:3 that an excellent spirit was within. Identity does not hinder success, it secures it. Now, just to recap or to look in the ending of this session, just to see what we have to look forward to. Recapping that in chapter 1, we see that Babylon attacked identity through assimilation, or making them to become similar to what was there. But then in chapter 3, we're going to look at how identity will be tested through intimidation. And then we'll look in chapter 6 and see how identity will be tested through legislation. And then we'll look throughout the book and see that identity is tested through elevation. Let's reflect on what we're going to and where we're coming from. Chapter 1 was subtle. It was quiet. It was cultural. But the later tests will be public, and they will be fiery, and they will be potentially deadly. And so it's so important to know that if identity is not settled in private, it will collapse in public. Next time, we're going to examine how identity stands when threatened with fire in Daniel chapter 3, because knowing who you are in God is one thing. Standing when death is the consequence is another. Until next time, may heaven smile upon you.